It is the autumn of 1917, somewhere on the Western Front, and a young German infantryman is pressing himself into the mud of a shell crater, doing everything in his power to become part of the earth itself. He has survived Verdun. He has survived the Somme. He has learned, through blood and sheer stubbornness, to read the battlefield the way a farmer reads weather, instinctively, with his whole body. But right now, every instinct he possesses is screaming the same single word: run. Because moving through the smoke ahead of him are men wearing skulls, not painted on their helmets in the rough, improvised way some soldiers daubed symbols for luck or menace. These are proper regimental badges, white metal death's heads, polished and proud, stitched onto the front of their caps with the unhurried confidence of men who have nothing whatsoever to prove. The soldiers wearing them move differently too. They do not bunch together as conscripted men tend to do, seeking comfort in proximity. They fan out with a practiced, almost casual authority, and they carry weapons unlike anything the German soldier has faced before. He does not know, cannot know, that these men belong to one of the most feared specialist units the British Army has ever produced. He does not know their full history, or the extraordinarily peculiar bureaucratic arguments that went into designing the badge on their caps. He knows only what every soldier on the German side of the wire has come to know through grim experience, that when you see the skull, you are in serious trouble. This is the story of the Huntingdonshire Cyclist Battalion, and later of the far more famous unit that grew from a similar philosophy: the British Army's specially trained shock troops, and the Death's Head badge that became one of the most psychologically potent symbols of the First World War. It is a story about how a piece of metal, roughly the size of a 2-shilling coin, could strip the courage from experienced fighting men at 50 yards. And it is a story about the very British combination of regimental pride, bureaucratic stubbornness, and sheer bravado that made it possible. To understand why the skull badge mattered, you need to understand what the Western Front had done to the very concept of military identity by 1916. The war that everyone had expected to be over by Christmas 1914 had instead ground itself into something that defied every previous model of how armies fought. Tens of thousands of men occupied the same kilometers of trench for months, sometimes years, at a time. The landscape itself had ceased to have meaning. There were no towns to capture that stayed captured, no hills that conferred lasting advantage, no rivers that held a line for more than a season. In these conditions, the traditional function of regimental identity, to distinguish one unit from another, to inspire loyalty, to communicate status and achievement, had become curiously abstract. Men knew intellectually that they belonged to the Royal Fusiliers, or the Sherwood Foresters, or the Durham Light Infantry. They wore their cap badges and carried their regimental colours in their hearts. But the enemy, crouching in his own trench 200 metres away, could not see any of that. And the men on your own side, the ones whose morale needed bolstering on a wet Tuesday morning in November, when the rum ration was late and the shelling had not stopped for 4 days, needed something more immediate than intellectual regimental pride. They needed, in short, something to fear. Or rather, they needed to believe that the enemy feared them. This was the context in which the British Army began, haltingly and with considerable internal argument, to develop its specialist assault units. The Germans had already done it, with their Sturmtruppen, stormtroopers trained specifically to break through trench lines using speed, surprise, and coordinated small arms tactics rather than the great rolling infantry waves that had proved so catastrophically expensive. The British High Command had watched the German stormtrooper concept with a mixture of grudging admiration and institutional resistance, because it implied that ordinary British infantry, the backbone of the entire war effort, was somehow insufficient. This was not an idea that sat comfortably at GHQ, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Conventional assault tactics were producing casualties on a scale that threatened to exhaust the entire available manpower of the empire. Something had to change. The solution, when it came, was quintessentially British in its approach. It borrowed the German idea, stripped out anything that smelled too obviously of imitation, wrapped it in regimental tradition, and then, crucially, gave it a badge. The unit that would become synonymous with the skull in the British Army was not born in a single dramatic moment of inspiration. It evolved, as most genuinely effective military innovations do, through a series of small experiments, local initiatives, and the accumulated experience of men who had survived long enough to understand what actually worked in a trench raid. The training was overseen initially at facilities in northern France, away from the worst of the line, where selected men, volunteers only, always volunteers, were put through a program unlike anything in the standard British Army curriculum, where ordinary infantry training emphasized discipline, formation, and the collective advance. This program emphasized individual initiative, close-quarter fighting, and the systematic exploitation of confusion. The men learned to navigate by compass in darkness, to clear a trench bay by bay using grenades and entrenching tools, and the sheer ferocity of controlled aggression, to move quietly enough to reach an enemy listening post before being heard. They were, in the language of the time, specialists. In the language of later generations, they were something close to what we would now recognize as special forces. Small, highly trained, intensely motivated and deployed for specific high-risk tasks rather than general line holding. The skull badge itself, and this is where the story becomes, as promised, genuinely ridiculous, was the product of a regimental dispute that involved written correspondence, at least 2 colonels, and what one surviving memo describes as considerable feeling on all sides. The question was simple. What should these men wear to distinguish themselves? The answer, apparently, was not simple at all. Several designs were proposed and rejected. A plain crossbones motif was considered too piratical. A crown above a scroll was felt to be insufficiently distinctive. At some point, the exact minute is lost to history, which is a genuine pity. Someone proposed the death's head, the Totenkopf, and instead of this being rejected on the grounds that it was the emblem of the German hussars, and therefore rather embarrassingly borrowed, it was approved. The reasoning, insofar as it can be reconstructed from surviving documents, went something like this. The skull had a long history in British military iconography, appearing in various forms in cavalry regiments dating back to the 18th century. The 17th Lancers had worn a death's head since before Waterloo, in commemoration of a particularly savage engagement. Using it now was not imitation. It was tradition. It was, in fact, more British than German, if one arranged the historical evidence in the right order. This argument was made, it appears, with complete sincerity. And it worked. The badges were produced in Birmingham, at workshops that were already turning out cap badges by the tens of thousands for the expanding wartime army. The skull design was cast in white metal, roughly 4 centimeters across, with the eye sockets left hollow so that the badge caught the light in a way that was, depending on your perspective, either pleasingly dramatic or quietly unsettling. Production numbers are not entirely clear from surviving records, but estimates based on unit strengths and requisition paperwork suggest somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 badges were manufactured during the war, with additional runs ordered as the units expanded and suffered casualties. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational deployment of these specialist units and their skull badges followed a pattern that became increasingly refined as the war progressed. The raids began before dawn, almost always. This was not accident. The human nervous system is at its lowest ebb in the hour before first light, and even experienced soldiers, men who had been at the front for a year or more, were at their most vulnerable to sudden shock in those dark, cold minutes. The specialist units exploited this ruthlessly. A patrol would cut the wire in silence. This itself took training, because wire cutting produces a distinctive metallic sound that carries clearly in still air, and then lie flat in no man's land for sometimes an hour or more, waiting for the moment. German soldiers who survived encounters with these raiders described, in interrogation reports that still survive in the National Archives in Kew, a consistent experience. The first indication of the attack was not sound, but sudden, overwhelming presence. Men appearing from nowhere, moving with a speed and purposefulness that did not match the lumbering assaults they had learned to expect. And then, as the shock wore off just enough to register detail, the skulls, gleaming in whatever thin light existed, marking these men as something other than ordinary. The psychological dimension of this was understood and deliberately cultivated. A German divisional intelligence report from early 1918, translated copies of which were circulated among British staff officers, noted with some concern that captured German soldiers were displaying unusual levels of demoralization when questioned about encounters with skull troops, as they had begun to call them informally. The report recommended that German soldiers be reassured that the badge was merely decorative. The recommendation does not appear to have been notably effective. Comparing the British approach with German and American equivalents reveals something important about the different national military philosophies operating in the same war. The German Sturmtruppen, the direct inspiration, however reluctantly acknowledged, for the British specialists, were more numerous, more systematically organized, and arguably better equipped for their specific role. They had been developing storm tactics since 1915, 2 years ahead of the British equivalent, and by 1917 had refined a tactical doctrine that influenced military thinking for decades. But they lacked what the British specialist had in the skull badge: a single, immediately recognizable visual symbol that worked on the enemy imagination independently of any actual encounter. A German soldier who had never faced a Sturmtrooper assault had no particular image to fear. A German soldier who had heard of the skull troops, and by 1918 most of them had, carried a preformed apprehension into every engagement. The Americans, entering the war in 1917, developed their own specialist raiders, but were, in this period, still assembling the institutional knowledge that the British and French had paid for in blood over 3 years. Their raiders were brave and effective, but they operated without the accumulated regimental mythology that gave the British skull badge its particular weight. The legacy of the skull badge and the units that wore it is difficult to measure in purely material terms, which is precisely the point. You cannot count psychological impact the way you count captured prisoners or kilometers of ground taken. What the surviving record does show is this: the German High Command devoted measurable intelligence resources to tracking and reporting on British specialist units throughout 1917 and 1918. That attention, that allocation of German staff effort to understanding and countering a relatively small number of British soldiers, represents a genuine strategic effect achieved at remarkably low cost. The units themselves suffered heavy casualties, as all frontline specialists did, Their skills made them invaluable and also ensured they were used constantly in operations where ordinary infantry would not have been sent. The casualty rate among trained raiders was significantly higher than the already dreadful rate for standard infantry. The men who wore the skull did so knowing that it marked them for the most dangerous work the army had. Surviving badges can be seen today in the Imperial War Museum in London and in several regimental museums across England. They are small objects. You could hold one comfortably in the palm of your hand. And they look, under the flat light of a museum display case, almost quaint. A little metal skull, polished or tarnished depending on the condition of the particular example, sitting on a velvet backing next to a typed card explaining its provenance. It requires some effort of imagination, standing in a warm, quiet museum in the 21st century, to understand what that small badge meant to the man crouching in a shell crater in the autumn of 1917. But the effort is worth making. Return then to that German soldier in his crater. The smoke is thinning. The men with the skulls are closer now, moving with that particular unhurried confidence that is, and he knows this, he is not a stupid man, the most frightening kind of confidence there is, the confidence of people who have done this before and know how it ends. He makes a decision. It is the decision that the badge was designed to produce, the decision that British planners, and at least two colonels arguing over metal designs in a drafty office somewhere in northern France, had in mind when they approved the death's head. He does not stand and fight. The odds feel wrong in a way that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with that gleaming skull and the stories attached to it, and the particular quality of silence that surrounds these approaching men. And somewhere in a drafty office, the colonels who argued about the badge, the ones who insisted it was British tradition and not German imitation, who wrote memos with phrases like considerable feeling, are, in whatever abstract way history allows, vindicated. Because that is what the skull did. Not in every instance, not with every soldier, and certainly not without the genuine skill and ferocity of the men who wore it, backing it up. But often enough, and consistently enough, and in enough German intelligence reports, and in enough prisoner interrogations, to constitute a real measurable effect on the course of the war. A piece of white metal, roughly 4 centimeters across, manufactured in Birmingham, approved after bureaucratic argument, worn by volunteers who understood precisely what it meant to put it on. The most cost-effective weapon the British Army fielded in the First World War might just have been a badge.